Wild West was a period in American history that lasted from the mid-18 to the early 1900s. During this time, settlers, miners, and ranchers pushed the boundaries of the country further west. It offered the promise of wealth and adventure, attracting countless individuals to the frontier. However, life in the West was not easy, and many faced significant challenges, including violence and hardship. But why was the Wild West so difficult to tame? What made this vast region of the American continent so resistant to the efforts of those who wanted to bring order and civilization to its rugged landscapes? The answer is not simple and involves a combination of factors, including the tough geography of the West, as well as the social and economic forces that influenced its development. The geographical challenges were among the most significant factors that made the region so difficult to tame. The vast and rugged terrain, characterized by deserts, towering mountain ranges, and seemingly endless plains, posed formidable obstacles to settlers and explorers. In the deserts of the Southwest, such as the Mojave and the Sonoran, the sun beat down upon the parched earth, making travel and survival a constant struggle. The lack of water and the scorching temperatures made it difficult for settlers to establish permanent communities. The inhospitable conditions also made it challenging to construct roads and railways. The majestic mountain ranges, including the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, presented their own set of challenges. The steep, jagged peaks and deep, treacherous canyons made travel arduous and time-consuming. Settlers and explorers had to navigate narrow, winding trails, often facing the perils of rockslides, avalanches, and sudden changes in weather. The high altitudes and harsh winter conditions made it necessary for those traversing the mountains to possess exceptional skills and resilience. The Great Plains, stretching from Texas to Canada, offered a different kind of challenge. The vast, flat expanses of grassland seemed to go on forever, with few landmarks to guide travelers. The lack of trees and other natural features made it difficult to establish settlements and create a sense of permanence. Moreover, the plains were prone to extreme weather conditions such as blizzards, tornadoes, and severe thunderstorms that could completely wipe whole communities. Limited population density further compounded the difficulties posed by the rugged terrain. Settlements were often separated by vast distances, with little in between but wilderness and open country. These conditions made it near impossible to establish effective law enforcement. The lack of population also meant that there were few opportunities for education and health care, as schools and doctors were scarce. The social conflicts that plagued the West were another significant hurdle in the effort to tame the region. One of the most prominent and tragic incidents was the conflict between the expanding American settlers and the indigenous people who had called the land their home for countless generations. As the government pushed westward, seeking to establish control over new territories, it often did so at the expense of Native American tribes. Treaties were made and broken, leading to a series of wars and skirmishes that lasted for decades. The competing interests over land and resources, such as gold, timber, and grazing areas, fueled these conflicts, as did the fundamental cultural differences between the two groups. The tribes fought to maintain their traditional ways of life, while the settlers sought to impose their own values and beliefs and make a fortune in the process. The absence of a strong centralized authority also contributed to a culture of lawlessness and violence. In the early days of westward expansion, the federal government's presence was limited, and local law enforcement was often understaffed and underfunded. This lack of oversight allowed for the rise of outlaws, desperados, and gangs who preyed upon the weak and vulnerable. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy became symbols of the Wild West's untamed nature, their exploits immortalized in dime novels and newspapers. The prevalence of gun violence and the frequent use of vigilante justice further undermined attempts to establish law and order. In many cases, the line between lawmen and outlaws was blurred, with some sheriffs and marshals being little more than hired guns themselves. The Wild West was also a melting pot of diverse cultures, with Native American tribes, European immigrants, African Americans, and Hispanic settlers all vying for a place in the rapidly changing landscape. While this diversity brought vibrancy to the region, it also led to cultural clashes and tensions. Language barriers, religious differences, and racial prejudice all contributed to a sense of mistrust and animosity. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers, was a prime example of the discriminatory policies that were enacted in response to these cultural tensions. Similarly, the mistreatment and marginalization of African Americans, many of whom had come to the West in search of a better life after the Civil War. The challenges posed by these social conflicts made it difficult to establish general unity. Settlements were often divided with little incentive for cooperation. The constant threat of violence and lawlessness made it difficult for people to put down roots and truly invest in the future. The boom and bust cycle that dominated the economy was driven largely by the exploitation of natural resources, such as gold, silver, and oil, as well as the growth of industries like ranching and agriculture. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 sparked a massive influx of prospectors and adventurers, all seeking to make their fortunes. With the onset of the gold rush, California's population surged from roughly 14,000 in 1848 to over 220,000 by 1852. Similar rushes occurred in other parts of the West, such as the Comstock Lode Silver Strike in Nevada in 1859 and the Black Hills Gold Rush in South Dakota in 1874. The sudden economic surge brought rapid growth and prosperity to the region, but they were often followed by equally rapid periods of decline and abandonment. As the easily accessible resources were exhausted, many mining towns turned into ghost towns almost overnight. The cyclical nature of the mining industry meant that communities that had sprung up around the mines were often left to wither and die when the mines closed. The cattle industry, which became a major driver of the Western economy in the late 19th century, was also subject to a similar cycle. The open range system, in which cattle were allowed to graze freely on public lands, led to the depletion of natural resources. The harsh winter of 1886, known as the Great Die-Up, decimated cattle herds across the West, with some ranchers losing up to 90% of their stock. The resulting economic fallout led to the collapse of many ranching operations and the consolidation of the industry into the hands of a few large corporations. Agriculture as well was subject to the uncertainties of the Western climate and economy. The Homestead Act of 1862, which granted free land to settlers who were willing to farm it for at least 5 years, encouraged a wave of migration to the Great Plains. However, the arid climate and the lack of reliable irrigation made farming a risky proposition. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, caused by a combination of drought and poor farming practices, led to the displacement of millions of farmers. Social instability that resulted from these economic fluctuations was a major challenge. The lack of a stable economic foundation also meant that many communities lacked the resources to invest in infrastructure, education, and other essential services. The result was a society that was often characterized by poverty, inequality, and social unrest. The immense territories of the American West, which stretched from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, proved to be demanding for federal and local authorities seeking to maintain order and enforce laws. The sheer size of the region required significantly more resources to establish a strong presence. In the early days of westward expansion, the federal government's role in the region was largely limited to military expeditions and the establishment of a few scattered forts and outposts. The U.S. Army, which was tasked with protecting settlers and enforcing treaties with Native American tribes, was often understaffed and underfunded. The government's attempts to regulate the activities of fur trappers, miners, and other frontiersmen were often met with resistance and defiance. As the population of the West grew, the need for effective law enforcement became increasingly pressing. In many areas, the only law was that imposed by local vigilante groups or powerful individuals who took it upon themselves to maintain order. The famous vigilante group known as the Committee of Vigilance in San Francisco, which was formed in response to rampant crime and corruption in the city in the 1850s, was a prime example. The absence of effective government oversight also contributed to the proliferation of illicit activities in the West. Gambling, prostitution, and the sale of alcohol were all common in many Western towns and cities. The lack of regulation allowed these activities to flourish, often with the tacit approval of local authorities who benefited from the revenue they generated. The prevalence of these vices, combined with the lack of social and moral constraints, contributed to the perception of the West as a lawless and dangerous place. Federal government's attempts to assert its authority in the West were often met with resistance and resentment from local populations. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, which was sparked by the imposition of a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, was an early example of this type of conflict. Later, the government's efforts to regulate the activities of Mormon settlers in Utah Territory led to the Utah War of 1857-1858, which ended with the Mormons agreeing to submit to federal authority. Gradually, the federal government extended its reach into the West in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The establishment of national parks, such as Yellowstone in 1872 and Yosemite in 1890, helped to bring a measure of federal control to some of the region's most iconic landscapes. The passage of the New Lands Reclamation Act in 1902, which provided federal funding for irrigation projects in the West, marked a significant expansion of the government's role in the region's economic development. This brings us to the end of the video. If you found this content informative, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Till we meet again, keep your spurs sharp, partner.